Welcome to the show. Today we're going to look at job execution systems. Kirill, what are job execution systems and why are we talking about them today?
I'd like to talk about them with you today because I think it's an essential concept that everyone needs to understand when looking at also CI/CD systems, because it helps a lot not only to figure out how they work, but also simplify decision making, how to choose between different job execution systems also for your CI/CD pipelines.
Yeah, great. And I'm really looking forward to it, as I haven't really thought about job execution systems myself. I usually call them a little bit different, but let's go back to that a little bit later. Before we get going with the technical things, I've changed my location, and a lot of people that have been watching my show maybe know that. Every time that I'm recording, I give the person joining a possibility to choose the next sticker that goes on my back somehow, right? So I have picked 3 stickers for you that you need to choose one. The first one that I have for you is move fast, be agile. Yes, there is an AWS logo on it. Then I have my pre-invent hike sticker from 2022. And last but not least, I have the community.aws sticker, which is marketing the content part of AWS. Kira, which one do you want to have up next of those 3?
I choose move fast, be agile because I'm all into speed and iterating quickly and progressing fast. And being agile, of course.
Cool. Then let me put that in the back. And I will later stick that on. Kirill, you are one of the very few people that are not coming from my AWS bubble, right? Which I'm usually working on. How did we meet, and do you still remember the first time we met?
I do. We met, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago at FICO. And we've been doing cloud transformation and migration together for some of the projects there.
Yeah, and that was very cool. And since then, we haven't met that often. I think we met lately at the summit in Berlin. But I'm looking forward to get your knowledge into my show and also to do some more stuff with you and other parts of your team. What do you do today, right? When we met, you were a contractor working for your own, and as far as I remember, and now you're doing something different, right?
I like to talk about myself as a DevOps platform engineering and cloud consultant, only that in the last couple of years, the focus shifted from being alone to working as a team, as part of the company I co-own called mkdev. So it's basically what you saw me doing some years ago, but now as part of a bigger team, all coming from mkdev.
Cool. And I hope that some of that knowledge is also what we're going to hear today. So let's go back into technical things. How do you define job execution systems? What are they, and what the hell do we use them for?
I realized a bit too late that when I talked about job execution systems, the more common term is workflow execution systems, but the idea is exactly the same. And that's basically some kind of system that allows you to run jobs. And at the simplest job execution system is the human. So when you want to run some script, for example, you want to create a backup of your database server, you would just SSH to a database server and perform a backup manually. So in this case, you are the job executor. There is no fancy system around it.
That's essentially how we did automation 15 years ago in our industry. And that's how I started my career, with copy pasting PHP files on a server, right? That was Johannes as a job execution, a workflow execution system at the end.
It works in many cases really good, right? Especially if you're, let's say, 1-2 person startup. Quite often you will have to do things manually and stuff like that. There is like no shaming around this. But eventually you need to basically have some kind of a more sophisticated system that can scale. And what basically you need in this case is kind of 3 components, as I like to look at them, is the job server, job scheduler, and the job executor. And if you look at any kind of CI system, the CI/CD system as well, you will find these components in place. So job scheduler is some software that decides where to run jobs, because maybe you have only one job server where jobs are running, maybe you have multiple ones, and you need something to decide where you run them. And then
where and I think also when to run those jobs, right? That's part of the scheduling component as well.
That's especially important in the context of CI/CD systems because hopefully most of our CI/CD jobs are triggered automatically based on some events, which is different to, for example, let's take a system like Rundeck, which is used a lot to automate patching, for example. And this one quite often is run either ad hoc when you go to the Rundeck UI and then you trigger the job to happen, or you have some schedule like nightly patches. And CI/CD systems, they're not pull based most often, except GitOps systems, but they're push based and they're triggered by some events.
Okay, so what common job execution or workflow execution systems are you aware of, and have you been working with in your career?
I had to work with quite many. I think that's also why I have this kind of the concept level, which is very important for me to understand, because there are often discussions like, oh, should we pick Jenkins or GitHub Actions for CI/CD jobs, for example. And in the end, it doesn't matter which tool you choose, but it's also important to remember that in many cases, it matters way less than we think because all of them do the same stuff. But you would not want to do, for example, CI/CD with Rundeck or with Airflow. They are also job execution systems, but they're tailored to completely different use cases.
What does that mean? I think isn't that the same concept at the end? So why do you why do you say that that's a different use case at the end? Couldn't I run my CI/CD pipelines on Airflow as well if I want to?
Definitely, because all the bits and pieces are the same. So you have some way to define what you want to run, and you have some way to connect many different servers where you run these jobs. And then in the end, you can do building container images, pushing them to the registry, and triggering deployments on ECS or Kubernetes, for example, all from Airflow. The difference is most often is the UI. So what kind of user layer developers of such systems put on top of the basic concepts. And then Airflow is just not built with the same primitives as, not primitives, but with the same UI as GitHub Actions or Jenkins. Well, Jenkins is a special case because Jenkins is the right on the edge between like being this raw job execution system and being CI/CD related, because it's so powerful and so flexible that you can use it practically for anything. Even though for sure it's mostly used for CI/CD. But there's so many examples where Jenkins is used, for example, to create reporting. So there would be some BI jobs in Jenkins that connects to databases and generates some report. And then is it CI/CD?
Yeah.
For sure not. But here you'd say we're using CI/CD tool to do something that is usually would be done with Airflow, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that's a very important point, as I've also seen GitHub Actions doing a lot of kind of these things, right? You can also use GitLab to execute specific tasks or reporting functionalities across all of your source base or something like that. I think it always depends on what you're aiming for, right? I would see Airflow more in a way of being integrated into an application, if that makes sense. And there are similar systems, I would say, that can also be used for the same purpose. So seeing them as building blocks for your application is what I have in mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and there are also things that we always look for in CI/CD system, right? So, for example, we always want to have integration with our source control. So ideally, it should really nicely integrate with GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket. And then, for instance, if you pick again Rundeck, there is nothing like this. There is no this nice thing that you open a pull request and then there is some automation happening.
Yeah. And if I look at the AWS landscape, sorry to drag you there, but there's at least 3, maybe 4 workflow orchestration or job execution systems that I can think of, which is kind of maybe even more if you think about it a little bit broader, right? But I think there's always a lot of choices in how to do this. And I wonder that there's no standard across them. So what I'm thinking of is like that the definition of a job is similar in GitLab and GitHub Actions or GitHub at the end because you have that like YAML file. It is similar in Code Catalyst, which is an AWS tool. But if you then look at the definition for a step function or for a code pipeline on AWS, it is totally different. But at the same time, it does the same thing, right? It's also a job execution or workflow execution system in that way.
Yeah, but the lack of standard is true because even I think the single standard we have there is the YAML format, but then the differences inside this YAML format are huge, and that's what also kind of differentiates good CI/CD systems built on top of job execution engines from the bad ones. For example, one of the key differences between GitLab and GitHub.jc is that GitHub Actions really nailed reusable actions. I know that you talked a lot about GitHub Actions on your show, but still, I find it amazing because in GitLab CI, the whole reusage of different pipeline steps is basically concatenation of YAML files. So you just really say include this YAML file in this other YAML file, and that's very different from GitHub Actions, where you actually have the whole like primitive of reusable step with its own release schedule and how it has like inputs, outputs, and versioning and all of these things.
Yeah, that is true. I think GitHub is easier to use there, and other systems don't really offer that from a CI/CD perspective. So in Jenkins, you can have something like libraries, so they become reusable, but they are harder to maintain from my perspective, and they are more complex. But of course, they offer way more options than you have in GitHub Actions out of the box. Code pipeline, code build does offer reusable actions, but not in a combination. So more building blocks that you then need to stitch together, right? And your pieces of code or your definition of your pipeline. And then Code Catalyst doesn't have that option at all yet.
Code Catalyst, I still did not have got time to look into it, but does it integrate with other CI/CD systems instead, or?
No, it just it integrates with other source control systems today, but it does not integrate with other CI/CD systems. It has a job execution system on its own, which is also YAML based. Yeah.
But you mentioned step functions, which is nothing is because why primary cloud is AWS. So I'm also like very biased there. But I think step functions is a good example of when just the job execution system is not good enough for CI/CD, because it's super powerful. You can connect everything together, all of your like 500 AWS services plus external services and any kind of custom application into really powerful workflows. But the amount of things you need to do from scratch just to get to this basic functionality of a modern CI/CD system is huge. And another system similar to this is Tekton for Kubernetes, which because Kubernetes essentially is like it's a perfect job execution system. It's like one of the main core benefits of Kubernetes is that it has this super cool scheduler and all these primitives like pods and deployments and config maps and secrets, and then you can build any kind of system on top of it because they handle this job execution part with resource management. And then of course it felt like a natural foundation for a CI/CD system, so people built Tekton. But if you start using Tekton, we have a couple of videos about it on mkdev channel. It's insane how many simple steps you need to do just to get to the same level as code pipeline or GitHub Actions. Because integration with source control, something simple that you push a commit and then you have a pipeline triggered. In Tekton and also in step functions, you will have to write lots of boilerplate, like lots of duct taping just to make it happen. There is nothing native in step functions for this.
But that's true. One comment on step functions, and then we go a little bit more into Tekton, right? So I see step functions more on the side of being part of your application and not part of your CI/CD system. But I have seen people building CI/CD systems based on that. Now, a trigger might not be pulling from source control or something like that. A trigger might not be a webhook. A trigger might be something landing on S3, and from there the deployment starts or something like that, right? Which is where step functions today offers more possibilities than Code Catalyst does, to be honest, which is bad because Code Catalyst is a purpose-based, purpose-built software at the end, right? So I think step functions plays a good and important role in workflow and job executions within your applications, especially within serverless applications that you build. But it should not be misused for things like CI/CD, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Now, back to Tecton. Tecton, the way that I have looked at it, it's really just a system for orchestrating any kind of workloads and not a CI/CD system, or am I wrong with that?
It is meant to be used for CI/CD systems. The idea is to be kind of not to be a fully featured CI/CD system like GitHub Actions, but also to give a bit more than just the plain Kubernetes. So then they have different custom resource definitions like task pipeline that you can then connect to your own CI/CD system. So really the idea is that it's like a Lego of different CI/CD components, and you have to build your own on top of it. And that shows the weakness of this approach, because of course, if you're a huge organization with like thousands of people, then you can probably invest time into building this kind of super custom CI/CD system just for your organization. But for most organizations, why would you build this from scratch? So it's kind of in this, like, they give you everything CI/CD system needs to have, and now connect it. Just as an example, to get what you mentioned before, that you push a commit, and then the pipeline is triggered. In Tecton, you have to have, I think, 6 or 7 different Kubernetes objects interconnected together that you need to bundle with a Helm chart or with one huge YAML file.
But wouldn't you come? So we didn't plan for this, but it's fun. Wouldn't we build this in a way like I would have an Argo CD reading from the source control system, pushing an object onto the Kubernetes API that is then read by Tecton? So we would combine different tools to trigger the relevant jobs. What would be the approach?
In this case, I mean, Argo is kind of it's only a CD system, right? So there is no CI there. Basically, it reads from, and it's a bit of a separate topic of what GitOps tools are, but essentially what they do periodic git pull, and then they do kubectl apply with way more features on top with a nice UI, but that's what most GitOps tools are essentially about. And then everything before this kubectl apply performed by a GitOps system is happening inside your CI system. So you need to have some other system to test and build the image, and then Argo CD or Flux CD or any other tool. And by the way, it doesn't have to be GitOps specific system. Any CI/CD system can be a GitOps system. So I'm always a bit irritated when people say we want to do GitOps, and then of course we need Flux. No, like if you want to do GitOps and you don't have enough like resources to dive into a new tool, then you don't need to introduce one more tool just for the GitOps part.
That is true. And Victor Fates was recently posting a video around how GitOps killed our CI/CD strategy in total, which is, of course, a little bit clickbaity. But in the first few minutes, he has a few very important points around what GitOps actually means. So let's go back to Tecton. Tecton is Tecton now really a job execution system, an orchestration system, or is what role does Tecton play for you? So you had those 3 buckets at the beginning, where you said we have job scheduler, we have job server, and we have, what was the third point? The job executor. Where do you think Tecton plays?
If you look at Kubernetes, the job scheduler is a Kubernetes scheduler, so it's the one that you already have in your cluster. And then job executor is your pod, and then job server is basically your Kubernetes nodes if you have nodes and you're not using something like Fargate. Tecton goes on top of Kubernetes, so for the job scheduling, Tecton just relies on Kubernetes. Basically, there is no scheduler in Tecton itself. Same for job servers and executors. It's all based on Kubernetes. What Tecton gives you is a bit more CI/CD specific custom resource definitions. So there is nothing.
Okay.
It's still very base level of job execution system, but they would just rename some components to sound more like CI/CD, like pipeline and task, plus give you some more stuff to connect to external events. And Tekton was originally born out of, if I'm not mistaken, from Knative, which is this way more generic system built to kind of trigger something inside the Kubernetes cluster based on events. So an event could be an HTTP request or could be some event in the queue. As in Tekton came out.
Yeah, and then Tecton is a little bit tailored towards the CI/CD part of it, and also the building blocks kind of it, part of it, I think. Cool. So let's go back to job execution systems and where you actually use them in your day-to-day role or day-to-day job. Let's move a little bit away from the CI/CD landscape. What workflow execution or job execution systems have you been integrating in your day-to-day job into the applications that you build with mkdev? In the past few years, let's say the past 2 years, because we are in a fast-changing industry.
Yeah. Outside of CI/CD, a lot of what I've been doing was involving, for example, SQS and different queuing systems, which is roughly, you can also map the same concepts there, or streaming applications where it's like instead of the queue, you have some kind of a data stream with Kafka or Kinesis. That's probably one of the most popular things out there. Airflow is still often there, but quite often my job or the job of my team is about setting up Airflow and making it scale and available to, for example, the analytics team or ML teams, which they can use there. And yeah, there's also lots of services in the whole machine learning stuff. There is Kubeflow, which then bundles like 20 plus different services into this ultimate way to also, among other things, run jobs on top of Kubernetes.
Ah, okay. I didn't hear about that yet. Okay, and if you would look at this landscape of 500 million tools to execute jobs, can you name the ones that you kind of prefer? So you mentioned Rundeck multiple times. You mentioned Airflow. You mentioned GitHub Actions. What is the one that you would choose for CI/CD today, and what is the one that you would choose for application integration today if it would be your free choice and you would be running a new startup?
For CI/CD, to be honest, I don't have a strong preference because my preference is that it's as easy to use for developers. And what's easiest to use for developers is usually what's tightly integrated with source control. So that's why that was the original power, let's say, of GitLab, because way like many years before GitHub, they had CI integrated into your source control. So you had your code and then you had all your pipelines in the same place. You never had to have another separate system. And thinking this terms, anything like GitLab CI, GitHub Actions, I forgot what was the thing from the Bitbucket. They always have an advantage, even though they don't cover some of the use cases. For GitOps workflows, my preference is Argo CD, just because it gives you this kind of centralized UI with many integrations with SSO and extra features. I like the simplicity of Flux CD, but in the end, it's always nice to give again to your developers, because you always, in terms of CI/CD systems, you always have to keep in mind your developers if it's going to be convenient for them. And then Flux CD is really cool, but it doesn't have a proper UI with SSO, for example.
For Argo CD, then you also use Argo workflows and Argo events, or do you stick to the CD portion of Argo?
I didn't get to use Argo workflows that much, to be honest, because and that's actually probably a good comparison with Tekton. We did at mkdev some research comparing the current state of Tekton versus Argo workflows, and you can see that just by popularity, by Google Trends number of content published, Argo workflows is like 5 times more than Tekton. Tekton kind of had its peak 5 years ago and then just died out. But Argo workflows is huge, and many companies use it. I personally did not get to use it that much for the reason that in most cases, if you have GitHub, most likely you're going to have GitHub Actions. There are many niche, or not niche, like there is Circle CI, for example, an excellent CI/CD systems that also crazy amount of companies use. But in the end, for me, because for me, it's many different projects and companies. It doesn't matter that much. I don't have a strong preference. It's whatever works for the company. Because coming back to the beginning where we started, in the end, every CI/CD system is a simple job execution system. So
That is true. And from a job execution system that you integrate into your applications, what would be your choice?
I like Lambda a lot, if you can call it a job execution system, which I guess you can also, there is some scheduler for Lambda function in AWS. In general, AWS has really good base services for running stuff. This new event bridge pipes is an excellent addition because they just removed a huge amount of duct taping you always had to do to connect to services with a better abstraction. And I feel every good progress on infrastructure layer is about offering a better abstractions.
Yeah, I agree with that. What I see is that a lot of the things that AWS does is specialized stuff and building blocks these days. I'm yet to see something like a more higher level abstraction from a building block perspective, right? Which I would love to get here as well. Like the most common combinations of step functions and lambda integrations, or the most common patterns. I know we have serverless lands where we can steal a lot of ideas and integration patterns, right? But AWS doesn't really offer more high level integrations. That's I think something that would be cool to get
For
to make it easy.
non-serverless stuff, I really love AWS Copilot, which they released, I think, 3-4 years ago, which is an open source tool. And what it does essentially, it duct tapes many different services, but it gives these abstractions because it gives you like 5 types of services. So it's like a request-driven service, backend service, worker, and a static website, and really simple manifests that then transform to horrible, huge CloudFormation templates, which ideally you would not touch or see, but they're there. So it seems to be one of the approaches from AWS is to kind of, instead of creating new service that gives these good abstractions, is to duct tape existing services with an open source tool. And that's like AWS Copilot and also AWS SAM, the serverless architecture or application model. Same direction, right? They give you kind of a simpler way to configure your Lambda functions connected to different inputs.
Cool. I never looked at that, to be honest. At AWS Copilot. Need to have a look. Thank you for that hint. Cool. Kirill, I think we made it through the content we had prepared for today. Where can people find more about you, get in contact with you, maybe get your professional advice on some stuff? How do they reach you? What's the best way?
All my professional content is concentrated in my LinkedIn account. Plus, I would also recommend to subscribe to mkdev's YouTube channel, where I and also my co-founder Pablo, we share lots of videos on different topics, including CI/CD, mostly around Google Cloud, AWS, and cloud native stack.
Cool. We'll add that to the show notes as well. And with that, Kirill, thank you so much for taking the time to record this with me and for sharing your knowledge and experience. I think this was a great session with a lot of interesting conversations, even though we didn't plan a few of them. But I think we went very detailed, and I hope that anyone listening learned a lot. And if you have any more questions, please add them to the comments or reach out to Kirill or to myself directly.
Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.